Lockheed Martin's F-22 Raptor is widely seen as the most potent air superiority fighter in the skies today. And its immense success prompted some within America's defense apparatus to call for a bigger version of the stealth jet to serve as a highly survivable medium-range fighter bomber. This effort was eventually dubbed the F-22, and it gained the favor of Air Force Secretary James Roche among a number of others, before ultimately being discarded for other bomber options. In fact, it may have even been some of the hard discussions related to the F-22 that ultimately pushed the B-21 Raider off the drawing board and into active development. This F-22 stealth bomber would have shared a number of components with its fighter counterpart, though it would have added significant range and payload, as well as a second crew member. The goal was really to meet the Air Force's need for a regional or medium-range bomber that could bridge the capability gap between fighter air-to-ground operations and long-range bombers with heavy payload capabilities. If it had been put into production, the F-22 would have been the stealthiest fighter bomber on the planet, and the only supersonic stealth bomber to ever enter operational service for any nation. By now you may be thinking to yourself that an F-22 just sounds an awful lot like a stealthy F-15E Strike Eagle, and the truth is there are some similarities, but there were also some important distinctions, chief among them being range. But before we can really appreciate how big a deal the F-22 could have been, we need to think about how big a deal the F-22 really was. You see, the development of the F-22 Raptor really dates all the way back to 1981, when the US Air Force first identified a pressing need for a more advanced fighter that could really more effectively counter the Soviets' new jets like the Su-27 Flanker and the MiG-29 Fulcrum. While today we recognize that the Soviet Union was only about a decade from collapse, the communist nation remained a potent threat at the time, both literally and in terms of perception within the defense community, with the stated aim of offsetting any potential Soviet advantage created by these new highly capable fighters. The Air Force stood up its Advanced Tactical Fighter program, before ultimately choosing Lockheed's YF-22 over Northrop's YF-23. There's no denying that the F-22 Raptor that resulted catapulted military aviation into a new era. The new jet could keep up with the MiG-29 and the Su-27 in a drag race, and it even offered similar thrust-vectoring acrobatic capabilities. But it absolutely outclassed its Soviet competition when it came to survivability. The F-22 Raptor wouldn't even need to prove that it could fly alongside the MiG or the Flanker, thanks to its incredibly small radar cross-section and limited infrared detectability. In other words, the Raptor could kill the best Soviet fighters in the world before they even knew it was there. It would take nearly 20 years to go from inking the contract to putting Raptors into service, but as Lockheed's game-changing jet prepared for its operational debut near the end of 2005, the fighter had already made such an impression on defense officials and lawmakers alike that some began asking, why aren't we making this thing into a bomber? Now, if you found yourself asking what's the difference, then you probably already know that modern fighter jets are really expected to be able to do just about anything that you ask of them, whether that means engaging enemy aircraft traveling at 1,000 miles per hour, or dropping bombs on bad guys 30,000 feet down. But despite that, most fighters today are still tailored to a specific mission set. The F-22, as a pertinent example, was designed from the ground up as a replacement for America's undefeated air superiority champ, the F-15 Eagle. And that means the F-22 was made specifically to duke it out with highly capable enemy fighters in the sky. But the F-35 was still years away, and America's first stealth aircraft, the F-117 Nighthawk, was already gliding toward retirement by the time the F-22 came on the scene. That meant the Air Force had a need for a deep penetration strike aircraft that could do things even the incredibly capable new F-22 just couldn't. And the industry knew that. According to a 2005 Congressional Research Service report, Lockheed actually set to work on an FB-22 design back in 2002. Their intent was to leverage a lot of the same components as their new F-22, to not only reduce design and production costs, but also to streamline training for both operators and maintainers. But cost wasn't the only consideration. According to that same congressional report, it was really the F-22's potential speed that really caught the DoD's attention. You see, today, just like in the early 2000s, the U.S. Air Force operates only one supersonic bomber, the heavy payload-capable B-1B Lancer, which tops out at around 900 miles per hour, or right around Mach 1.2. The Air Force believed an F-22 would achieve speeds as high as Mach 1.8, or nearly 1,400 miles per hour, making it well-suited for rapid strikes when time was of the essence. The F-15E Strike Eagle, which entered service in 1988, was capable of reaching even higher speeds, with a top end of Mach 2.5 at altitude, but it offered a combat radius similar to that of many other fighters, at less than 700 miles or so. The F-22 would do much better than that. But before they could prove it, Lockheed Martin needed to design a bigger Raptor, and they started by stretching the fuselage of the F-22 to add a second pilot station. The two pilots could then take shifts serving as pilot or navigator throughout long bombing missions. Surprisingly, this required very little change to the overall design. The biggest change would be in the wings. The F-22 would borrow a page out of a previous effort to field a different fighter-bomber, and the F-16XL, which was successful in testing but failed to ultimately produce an operational aircraft. The F-16XL leveraged large delta-shaped wings that dramatically increased lift and fuel capacity, and the F-22 aimed to do the same. But while these new wings did indeed add lift and fuel storage, they also came at a cost, and as we mentioned before, the F-22 would have been slower than its fighter counterpart, with a top speed of Mach 1.8 rather than the Raptor's Mach 2.25. But sometimes slow and steady wins the race, that is, if you can call Mach 1.8 slow, because the F-22 would have offered an operational range that was twice or even 3 times that of the F-22. According to some often cited Lockheed Martin estimates, the F-22's combat radius would have stretched all the way out to 1,800 miles. That's a pretty big leap from the F-22's 600 or so. Those new wings would also have a detrimental effect on the aircraft's acrobatics, and while the F-22 could withstand 9 Gs while maneuvering, the F-22 would be limited to just 6. But it's important to note that that's still actually better than the F-16A was originally, and would be pretty incredible for a medium-range bomber carrying 35 bombs in its pack. The most impressive change the F-22 design would bring to the table were the advances made in stealth since the F-22's design had been finalized a decade prior, making the F-22 even stealthier. According to John E. Perigo, who was the senior manager for combat air systems at Lockheed Martin at the time, the F-22 would have been the stealthiest aircraft ever built. He went on to say that the F-22 would be capable of going places and surviving that even the B-2 Spirit couldn't. We're talking about some pretty big claims here. The extra square footage the F-16XL got out of its delta wings allowed for a massive 27 hardpoints for ordnance, or bombs and missiles, but the F-22 aimed to beat even that, with plans for a whopping 35 mounting stations for recently developed 250-pound precision-guided small-diameter bombs. But stealth aircraft have to carry their munitions internally so as not to compromise their stealth profile, and finding a way to cram all these bombs into an F-22 was all but impossible. So Lockheed set their sights on a premise that to this day has still yet to come to fruition. They would design stealth pods that could be mated beneath the wings of the F-22 to carry that ordnance, and according to their proposal, these pods wouldn't negatively affect the aircraft's stealth profile at all. The primary payload bay was also stretched and widened, however, to accommodate some larger weapons, including bombs that could weigh up to 5,000 pounds. The F-22's thrust vectoring capabilities were sacrificed in the F-22's design, as acrobatic performance wasn't really considered as important for a medium-range bomber. According to some outlets, there were also discussions of replacing the F-22's Pratt & Whitney F-119 PW-100 engines with a pair of Pratt & Whitney F-135s. Now, the F-135 would go on to power the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and running 2 of them could have pushed the F-22 to a reported top speed of Mach 1.92. New engines or not, the F-22 soon secured its highest profile fan in Air Force Secretary James Roche, who would go on to tell the House Armed Services Committee that he envisioned his branch buying at least 150 of these F-22 fighter bombers. But by 2006, the outlook had shifted from promising to grim for the F-22, as America was now fully entrenched in the global war on terror. While the F-22 did seem to offer a great bargain in terms of cost for capability, the need for that stealth capability was just less pressing. That same year, Lockheed Martin's latest stealth fighter, the F-35, was preparing to begin test flights and would ultimately provide the US with a second stealth fighter. Importantly, it would be a stealth fighter that placed a lot of emphasis on engaging ground targets. The F-22 concept would draw its last breath in a quadrennial defense review that same year. It's important to note that at the time, there were no stealth bombers in development for the United States, with plans to start development further down the road for a bomber that would enter service in the late 2030s. But today, we know America would start development on its next stealth bomber quite a bit sooner, when Northrop was awarded a contract to begin work on the B-21 Raider back in 2015. And that makes you wonder if some of those hard conversations about the capabilities offered by the F-22 didn't worm their way into discussion about a renewed great power competition and the need for a new stealth bomber sooner rather than later. And with that bit of unfounded conjecture ends yet another edition of Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment. I have a blast reading them all. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.